This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, welcome back, everyone. This panel may seem like an odd one out. It's the only one that doesn't have some form of the word theory in its title, but lyric poetry has been a central interest of Jonathan Culler's ever since he wrote his undergraduate thesis on George Herbert. In structuralist poetics, he was the first critic in structuralist poetics to call attention to the special role of deixis in the lyric. And his classic essay on apostrophe, which has you've already heard people invoking reverently, offers an approach to the lyric that he has greatly elaborated in his forthcoming book, Theory of the Lyric. I'm lucky enough to have read the book in manuscript, and I can tell you that it's a really formidable contribution to current debates about the status and function of lyric poetry. Given his long-standing interest in lyric poetry, it shouldn't come as a surprise that many of Jonathan's students have worked in this area, and today we'll hear from three of them, all of whom I've been lucky enough to know and work with as well. And I'll just introduce them all and then let them take over. Robert Baker earned his PhD in comparative literature in 1997 with a dissertation entitled Poetic Form, Poetic Fiction, and the Way of Extravagance, 20th Century Inventions. He's the author of The Extravagant Crossings of Modern Poetry and Modern Philosophy from Notre Dame in 2005, and In Dark Again in Wonder, the poetry of René Char and George Oppen, Notre Dame 2012. And he's also published a volume of translations of Char. He's a professor of English at the University of Montana. Ben Glaser received his PhD in English in 2012, and his dissertation was Modernism's Metronome, Metrical Vestiges, Historical Prosody, and American Poetry, 1910-1930, currently revising it as a book. He's also co-editing a collection of essays with Jonathan that explores new approaches to the study of poetic rhythm. Ben's focus on prosody has also led him to teach and write on hip-hop and other musical genres. He's an assistant professor of English at Yale. And Avery Slater received her PhD in English this year, writing a dissertation entitled Apparatus Poetica, The Question of Technology in the Mid-20th Century American Poetry. And she also has an MPhil from Cambridge in critical theory and an MFA in poetry from the University of Washington. Her criticism has recently appeared in American Literature, Cultural Critique, and Thinking Verse, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, where she teaches eco-criticism and technology studies. So I'm going to hand it over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me here. This is a delight and an honor. At one point, I was going to give a talk in response to Jonathan's well-known 2009 essay, Why Lyric?, where Jonathan sets up an opposition between reading the lyric for the as a dramatic monologue, or hermeneutic of the fiction of the poem, as I call it, versus reading the poem as a work that has to be understood through a structuralist analysis or through poetics. And I was going to attempt a revision of that, to put those on places on a continuum. And then I thought, if Jonathan attempted a revision of his own essay of that sort, it would be very interesting. If I did it, it would be one of those uninteresting and mercilessly brief talks that you alluded to yesterday. We're never going to let you forget that, Jonathan. Like Leland, I read Jonathan before I came to Cornell, and especially his book on Flaubert and his structuralist poetics. And so Jonathan was a teacher of mine from before I came here, and also someone I wrestled with, because my deepest instincts as a literary critic have always been a phenomenological analysis of the disclosive power of the work, as Jonathan knows, in tension with the phenomenology in Hegel's sense, or an historicist account of why certain shapes of poems, to borrow his term shapes of spirit, or types of poems become plausible, or especially convincing, or especially resonant at certain historical moments or certain cultural conditions. So I'm always wrestling with my own existential phenomenologist versus historicist, and also wrestling with structuralist and formalist accounts of poetry, which seem to be absolutely essential. So I thought I'd just do my thing, Jonathan, and you can correct me for however badly off the cliff I go. It's an indirect homage to Jonathan's tolerance, open-mindedness, and generosity that everyone's talked about. I saw him looking at me with bemused sympathy as I walked into a dark wood, waiting for me with the bread and water of clarity and brevity when I came back. So here goes. It's called The Poetry of Encounter. A few years ago, I wrote a book on René Char and George Opner, a French modernist poet and American modernist poet, two poets who might at first glance seem to have little in common. Char began as a member of the Surrealist movement, but by his late 20s, he was taking his distance from the movement. Char took his distance from Surrealism. In the Second World War, after the surrender of France, he was a leader in the resistance. In a notebook he kept during the war, Leaves of Hypnos, is one of his great works. Oppen, in his early poetry, was influenced by the objectivist poetics of William Zukofsky and Pound. From the end of 1934 through 1958, he wrote no poetry at all. He joined the Communist Party, became an activist, fought in the Second World War, returned to America, and then went into exile with his family, living in Mexico for a decade to avoid testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He began to write poetry again in 1958 and returned to America in 1960. His later poetry, while retaining the realist attention of his earlier work, has a greater meditative reach. In both Char's and Oppen's work, one feels the pressure of the catastrophes of the 1930s and 40s. In Oppen's work, the pressure of the 60s as well. The work of both is concerned with the vertigo of choice, the search for what matters, with the unforeseeable path of an individual or a shared life. The work of both, too, has affinities with existential phenomenology, with the effort to get past the habits of thought that block our perception of the basic conditions of our lives. Near the end of my book on these two poets, it's the book called In Dark Again in Wonder, I asked, what are we to make in our time of two poets so given to existential concerns with decision, with authenticity, with trying to see what is there? Can they still speak to us? How are we to hear them in a world characterized by an endless flow of images, a perpetual stream of information, a routine of consumption that has long since become second nature, a constructivist sense of experience that has become as natural as the air we breathe? Char and Oppen write a poetry of encounter, a lyrical phenomenology of care for presences and care for others. Thought leaped on us in that sea, Oppen writes at the end of one of his great poems. For in that sea we breathe the open miracle of place, and speak, if we would rescue love to the ice-lit upper world, a substantial language, of clarity and of respect. The work of Char and Oppen is connected to a long romantic tradition and to various ecological nomadic poetic orientations of our time. The poetry of the open, if now practiced under unlikely circumstances, is still with us. The longings it voices are still with us. Another way to approach this kind of poetry is in the light of modern philosophy. Over the last century, there have been two important traditions of existential phenomenology. The first, emerging in late Husserl, and then running from Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty through any number of contemporary ecological thinkers, tries to work past dominant theoretical models of our world in order to uncover the basic participation of human being in being. The second, though not usually called existential phenomenology, can be seen as a version of it. Running from Buber through Levinas and the recent work of Judith Butler, it's a tradition that tries to work past dominant liberal models of ethical orientation in order to disclose the basic relational space within which any ethical response occurs. These traditions, though different in their emphases, have affinities with each other. Both are in tension with the sociological perspectives that have been so influential in the academy over the last few decades. But in their concern with the concrete life of relationship, they're important counter-perspectives in an age marked by the power of a social system over human beings, as Horkheimer and Adorno put it. In this sense, they are allies of what I've called the poetry of encounter, written by poets as various as Wordsworth, Keats, and Hopkins, Neruda, Char, and Oppen, or in contemporary America, Forrest Gander, C.D. Wright, and Mame Bersenbrug, among many others. This, I would say, is a third tradition of existential phenomenology. The poetry of encounter responds to two widely felt fears of our time. One is the fear that we are locked in ourselves. These days, at least in the academy, inwardness is often stigmatized, said to involve an evasion of social responsibility or a dominative stance, or abandoned, said to be a bygone form of subjectivity no longer relevant to our horizontal age. And yet our novelists and sociologists suggest that though we are mobile and dispersed, we are as hopelessly locked in ourselves as ever. Inwardness, if in fact it is gone, is apparently not the same as narcissism or loneliness, which you find without it. We still long to be startled out of ourselves, startled out of our propriety, as Emerson says. Another of our fears is that we are locked in the machine. The machine has changed from the hour when the Romantics first expressed this fear. It is not exactly an iron cage, but as Foucault describes it, a flexible network that encourages disciplines, evaluates, normalizes, and to be sure, frazzles. Increasingly, it is virtual as well as actual. It follows you home, reminds you every day that soon you could be begging to be let back in it. These ordinary, if acute fears, are accompanied by two apocalyptic fears in our time. One is the fear that nature, the outward ground of life, is gone. We are told that reality has vanished behind a ceaseless production of images, that nature has been absorbed by an expanding capitalist system, that we've entered the Anthropocene, that technology has so reshaped nature, there's no nature left to encounter, that the planet is on the brink of ruin. Everywhere we go, these stories tell us, we find only ourselves and our pollution. Correlative fear is that if nature is gone, we are gone. Who are we? Where are we? If the nature we also are, if the nature that once upon a time we inhabited is gone. In this context, the poetry of encounter can be heard as an expression of hope. Despite John Ashbery's diagnosis, there's no remedy, he says, for this packaging which has supplanted the old sensations. The poetry of encounter proposes that our vocation is to be present to what is there, present to who is there, present to where we are. It's the year of the Magicicadi, we read in a passage of C.D. Wright's Deep Step Comes Shining, 17 years underground, boring slowly upward, ever so slowly. To get to the surface in the spring of the 17th year, it will scrabble through pavement. With not a minute to spare except for sex and song, it must escape its carapace. Quickly, we must all escape our carapace, come shining. The talisman of this kind of poetry might be the word openness, so often heard these days, in poetry, in fiction, in ethics, in politics. In part, this word expresses the ethos of our culture with the labile sense of the self and a post-colonial multicultural sense of being with others. No less audible on all sides, of course, is the violent reaction against this ethos. In part, though, it expresses a longing to be elsewhere, to touch and be touched, as C.D. Wright puts it. Perhaps for us, what the one life within us and abroad was for the Romantics, or the recovery of lost time for the modernists, or authenticity for the existentialists. Openness, what does this mean for us? I would like briefly to trace the path of one contemporary American poet, Forrest Gander, whose work exemplifies an engagement with the concerns I've just sketched. Gander is a poet of wakefulness. He is concerned with what Oppen calls the mystery that there is something for us to stand on, with the way the mind rises into happiness, rising into what is there, as he says, and with our social life, with what Oppen calls our being numerous, as well as our intimate relationships of love, family, and friendship. Science and Steeping Flower is the book in which Gander's gift fully emerges. It's a book that voices the wonder of our being here at all. It brings together different types of poems, love poems, poems, the earthy life, poems that turn toward the tragic dimension of things. All these poems move around a fourth body of poems that is at their center. Poems of creation, birth, coming to be. The first poem of the book speaks of a convulsive incision that tore light from matter. To Live Without Solace, the third poem in the book, is a poem that Roger has given you copies of. I'll read it. Some of you have two-sided copies. You got a bonus. You got for coming to my talk. This is To Live Without Solace. This is the meaning of the vision, the body sawing stride, before appearance appeared, God in the glint unmoving stood like a scarecrow in a garden of cucumbers. Though not God, it was without God's claw-tipped brain and unforeseeing, only an incisive force, a contraction and release, a woman's hand around bedposts, and the heavy elements and clouds of interstellar gas began to cleave into complex molecules whose signature and measure were unmistakable. In lithesome undulation, the world came true. Warblers adjusted their pitch by an order of magnitude. The day uprighted, gleaming with wounds. Sand crunched underfoot, and the air put on a blue cloak embroidered with swallows. The goat-lipped young men holding hands felt the throbbing begin, felt it beat into speech, and they called each other with throaty cluckings and amphetamine harps. The headbands tightened around their temples. When the intensity decreased, seared iron going ochre from cherry red, all reached out and touched the flickering rhythm like horse spires, and their nostrils flared, and they took a piece of the music between their teeth like meat, deer flies screaming their eyes. Still the pulse bowled them over. Breath endurance ceased, and the thing went inside them and out again as long as spoke, and they thrashed to remember what it was like. And the water croaked before a stalking crane. The poem recalls the pattern of an ode. The first stanza presents a picture of the birthing of all that is. The second stanza describes the coming true of the born world and sings the body electric. The world stands up, tactile clarities among the gifts of the world and its coming to be. A body meets the world and other bodies there. Who are these goat-lipped young men holding hands? Are they gathered to celebrate a Dionysian ritual out of which an art of tragedy will emerge? The third stanza evokes transitions in intensity. Already the intensity that has aroused the goat-lipped young men is going. Yet curiously it goes twice. It begins to go, and the men reach out for it and are bowled over by it. Then it goes again, this time for good, and the men thrash to remember what it was like. The mind in creation, Shelley says, is like a fading coal awakened to transitory brightness. To live without solace expresses at once a searing intensity and a longing for the return of this intensity. Gander's next three books, Torn Awake, Eye Against Eye, and Core Samples from the World, are quieter than Science and Steepleflower. The elation of the earlier book turns into the attention of the later books. The phenomenology of perception is still traced in these books, but they are especially concerned with the question suggested by the title of Eye Against Eye. That's the eye you see with. Each eye we are, has its view, its horizon, set against the views, the horizons of other eyes, of other selves. Where if only provisionally might these eyes themselves come to be reconciled? Is there a common world they might see together, or is the common world only the space of their unending collisions? Themes of travel and translation connect Eye Against Eye and Core Samples from the World. Gander is a prolific translator, particularly of Latin American poets. For him, translation is essential to the life of poetry. It has to do with seeing otherwise. Gander asked at one point in Core Samples what had taken him to another country. He says, I was looking for bonds. I wanted to break a mirror. I wanted to render myself accessible, available. I wanted to borrow eyes from another language. I was looking for the words to come. The basic movement of Core Samples is the crossing of borders. Each of the book's 4 sections includes a lyric with the same title, Evaporation, in a long sequence written in response to photographs, and a haibun, a travel journal including haiku. In the 4 journals, which recount trips to China, Mexico, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Chile, identity is shown to be unstable, formed through dialogue or conflict, formed in the realm of eye against eye. Everywhere the poet goes, he is seen as other, as the individual struggling to find the words he needs. And everywhere he goes, he sees that there's no single other, but only multiple others, multiple identities formed through dialogue or conflict. Ethnic and religious strife are ubiquitous. The traveling poet is embraced, rejected, teased, taught, left at a loss. The journals are based on trips Gander took as a poet. And if at times they have a distance quality, they are honest accounts of being both curious and off balance. Gander is a poet of earthiness and intensity, and a love poet, and is his origins a southern poet, bringing the landscapes of the South with him, gifted at weaving its idioms into his poems. His language, as that poem shows, has a kind of sheerness. Over the last 15 years, he has sought to widen the scope of his poetry, working with photographers composing different types of sequences and book-length poems. Yet the heart of his work, I think, remains the vision of Science and Steepleflower. Life for light is torn from matter. This is what keeps it all breathing, keeps the author able to step outdoors to see what is there, to hear other voices. As he says in Torn Awake, Equing Merleau-Ponty, he wants to stand where the crossing happens. For his sole collection of essays, he chose the title of Faithful Existence, a title that brings to mind the meaning of faith and openness to the yet to come, going on trust and intuition, and the meaning of faithful, loyalty, truthfulness. To live without solace is not to live without faith or faithfulness. It's to live in faithfulness to what is there, to what has happened in our lives, to what comes by the road to be thought, as Oppen puts it. Poetry, the Argentine poet Roberto Aros says, is the second birth of the sort all wisdom traditions have sought, or perhaps another awakening, this time to a reality that is open.
It's a tremendous honor to be here and to be able to thank you, Jonathan, for your support of my career of the humanities. and your contributions to the study of poetry and poetics. I came to Cornell, yes, in part to study with Jonathan in Parkside Reddit, but also because of the graduate community that had already formed here. I'm thinking people like Rob Lehman and Audrey Wasser, who over the years developed a theory reading group that could always depend on the class of 1916 chair for a decent chunk of their budget, and the rest from Dominic, hopefully. Usually the discussion. I can think of a lot of ways in which Jonathan's helped my career in very direct ways. I think my favorite was at the end of my A exams. It fell to Jonathan to deliver the bad news from Roger and Deborah Freed and him that I was not to use the word allegory for about a year. But that was enough. That got me thinking, what are the right critical terms, the ones that I'm presuming to use. In 2010, Jonathan asked me to co-chair a panel at the ACLA on rhythm and lyric, and I think it was really important for me to see. The ACLA has got like 2,000 people and 180 panels, and you never know whether anyone's ever going to show up, but possibly thanks to the proper name, prosody was standing room only for about 3 days, and that was nice to see for someone embarking on a project that didn't know who the audience was for. I wasn't surprised that only one of the 4 panels for today had a predetermined focus, and that was the lyric. At the ACLA conference this past spring, there was a roundtable discussion and launch for the Lyric Theory Reader, edited by Virginia Jackson and Yopi Prins, also standing room only. It's nice to see lyric, whatever the debates, being central at these events. Jonathan spoke there quite sharply. I think he'd admit about what he saw as the limitations of such a, quote, critical anthology. The anthology, for those not familiar, The anthology, for those not familiar, goes beyond surveying ideas and genealogies of lyric and expounds the position that lyric was a 20th century invention, a fiction that ultimately obscures the broader range of poetic genres and material practices from the past. Now, I subscribe to this historical argument about lyric reading as a critical action based on figures, sometimes ideologies, but I'm also very sympathetic to Jonathan's question of what, quote, he sent me the comments, so I kind of have permission to talk about this. I'm very sympathetic to this question of, quote, what alternate conceptual scheme we should use. The Lyric Theory Reader characterizes Jonathan's position as the desire for accounts of genre as, quote, a set of norms or structural possibilities. It's fair to say that the anthology is largely uninterested in or skeptical of essays that seek to create such accounts. In his remarks, Jonathan took this disinterest to be detrimental to the study of poetry and took as symptomatic several instances in which several incorrect descriptions of Baudelaire's sonnet Obsession as a, quote, prose poem. He also noted the anthology's removal of both Obsession and Correspondance from Paul de Man's anthropomorphism and trope in lyric. I have no way to determine whether this double erasure of Baudelaire's poems is a telling blindness or a typo, and am in even less of a position to speak about Jackson's understanding of de Man's concept of lyric reading in relation to her own theory of lyric reading as laid out in her book Dickinson's Misery. But since both Virginia Jackson, she's the reason I came here, she told me to go study with Jonathan Culler, but since both Virginia Jackson and Jonathan Culler have been intellectual guides for me for my entire career, and since that notorious essay by de Man, which I probably shouldn't be talking about here, I've made the necessary apologies, has so thoroughly structured my own understanding of genre, I wanted to return to the vertiginous relationship in that essay between reading and genre. I'll argue that de Man's essay can help us reconceive the argument surrounding the anthology's treatment of lyric. Somewhat reductively, Jackson's position is that it is only lyric reading that can make something lyric, that lyric reading is a fiction, or what de Man would call, in Jackson's view, a defensive motion of the understanding, and that we should therefore stop trying to read everything as lyric. Jonathan, for his part, said in his remarks that, quote, Obsession is not a prose poem that offers an alternative to lyric. It is for de Man the very instantiation of lyric. Specifically, it is a lyrical reading of Correspondance. If genre exists, in Jonathan's view, to permit the description of literature's structural possibilities and is linked to, quote, the givenness, the untranscendability of a particular language, then what is at stake here is not so much the name lyric, book aside, name lyric, but the possibility of articulating language's insistence upon its claim to imminence, innocence too, sure. Its own claim to imminence, its way of saying stick with the truth, my way of putting the truth into words. De Man is very direct in that essay in saying that obsession performs a lyric reading of correspondance, and that correspondance therefore cannot be a lyric. Quote, no lyric can be read lyrically, nor can the object of a lyrical reading be itself a lyric. Obsession violently, howlingly reincarnates correspondance's mute assemblage of tropes of songs and interiority. Yet, this is a question I want to ask, in what sense can obsession as the product of a lyric, or lyrical, De Man's term, reading be, as Jonathan puts it, an instantiation of lyric? The parallel between obsession's lyrical reading and De Man's critical reading of Obsession as a poem that insists upon subjective interiority by, quote, adding remembrance to the flat surface of time, suggests somewhat that Obsession may be equally caught up in a subsequent anthropomorphic or anthropomorphizing reading. Jackson in Dickinson's Misery aligns Obsession with De Man's own reading of Correspondance, arguing that De Man's reading projects subjective interiority onto Obsession to form the necessary antithesis of Correspondance's mere figurality. Barbara Johnson in Anthropomorphism in Lyric and Law, also in the Lyric Theory Reader, similarly reads De Man's lyric reading as anthropomorphizing the supposedly materialist historical modes of language power with which that essay famously ends. Yet if these arguments fairly diagnose in De Man's essay something like an anthropomorphizing movement toward lyric as the province of interiority, I sort of feel that De Man would say, how could it be otherwise? And what intrigues me here is the very real historical modes of reading power exemplified by both Obsession and De Man's essay, and which I think De Man's essay seems to more predict than succumb to. There is a violence in both Obsession and in De Man's lyrical readings, a metonymic displacement of non-lyrical or rhetorical language in favor of a something else that becomes maybe dialectically lyrical. But this can hardly be considered as errant as the army of critics that Jackson studies, turning everything that Dickinson kind of ever produced into subjective lyrics. So while I don't think that Obsession is, per De Man, necessarily an instantiation of lyric, I think it may be an exemplary instance of lyric reading, made all the more important by its place in the chain of readings continued by De Man. The sonnet is a critical and poetic exercise in unearthing the conditions of subjective experience that were latent in correspondence. It may be then that, quote, generic terms such as lyric are always terms of resistance and nostalgia, at the furthest removed from the materiality of actual history. That's De Man. But the term lyric may, for just this reason, I think, constellate a mode of critical reading that occurs within poems, and that is not restricted towards the various drives, many of which Jonathan has critiqued, towards represented utterances of speakers, individual expression, the dramatic monologue, or even in another register, musicality. What if Obsession, in its lyrical reading of Correspondance, is not quite an exemplary lyric, but an exemplary moment in a history of poetry reading itself, and specifically poetry reading its own tropological movements? Can we study lyric by beginning not with norms, but with Obsession and De Man's kind of double-barreled rejection of the tropes that ground lyric's intelligibility? Returning to the provocations of historical poetics, how can the study of lyric as, in effect, the history of lyric reading be situated with reference to historical language use and historical ideas about genre? Second half is a test reading, more or less, of Elizabeth Bishop's really fantastic poem, Casabianca. And at this point, if I'm not concise enough, you have a really good poem to read and look over. So, you know, I think Deborah Free taught me to do that. Just make sure to give them something in case they want to work out their own solution. So this was published in North and South in 1946. The poem alludes very directly to Felicia Heman's 1826 poem of the same name about the brave boy who went down with his father's ship, L'Orient, at the 1798 Battle of the Nile between Nelson and Napoleon's fleet. It begins, famously, "The boy stood on the burning deck whence all but him had fled. The flame that lit the battle's wreck shone round him o'er the dead." I'm guessing a decent number of people here have encountered that. Catherine Robeson has argued extensively in her book Heartbeats. She's extensively studied the pedagogical history of this poem in English national culture, specifically as an object of required memorization and recitation. Indeed, for more than 80 years after it was published, the poem appeared in dozens of elocutionary handbooks. I won't rehearse Robeson's argument or go into all of those handbooks. I thought about giving you a list because, I don't know, there's just so many. They all seem like the same thing, but there's just so many. Same thing's true of prosody manuals. There's so many. But by the late 19th century, it was an oft parodied and notorious precisely as an elocutionary model. The Elocutionist Journal of July 1879 tells the story of a, quote, reluctant young professor of elocution, and, quote, yanked out of bed, hoisted onto a chair to recite the poem with, quote, a good many quavers. The Emerald City of Oz has a more successful chicken. Eat an elocution pill and recite the poem without making a single mistake. So whatever the 1826 poem was, ballad, literary ballad, bizarre patriotic vision, and whatever it has become in feminist and other reevaluations of humans or the figure of the poetess, its primary genre by the mid to late 19th century seems to have been the rather non-lyrical performance genre of the elocutionary example. Unfortunately for the poem, its defenses against reception had given way to an alien mode of language power defined by a pedagogical machine. We might say that the poem was at this point barely a poem in our modern critical sense, having been variously reprinted as prose with semicolons added, as 14ers with lines 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 of each stanza put together, and in the, I believe, second example, with italics there to force students to pronounce their dentals and plosives. It's interesting how, this is my favorite of all of them by far, it's interesting how in this particular reprinting it becomes very, very hard to get the rhythm right. Even harder, I think, than it was for school children trying to perform both elocutionary rigor and, really against the poem's syntax, metrical regularity. When I came across this citation, I didn't immediately realize, don't read the whole book, so I didn't realize what the italics were for right away, and I thought they might have showed stress. That makes sense for the word stood, which is in danger of being ignored in favor of the meter. The boy stood on the burning deck. That's probably about 98% of recitations throughout time would have done that. Indeed, one handbook uses that line to correct the, quote, error of reading literally and uniformly according to rhythm without regard to emphasis. Old problem. Yet even the poor student who knows what the italics are there to do, I think, will experience a real difficulty in being made to focus on unstressed syllables like but and had, while at the same time placing the correct sort of speech emphasis on adjacent syllables. It's a really cruel thing to do to a student. No doubt such difficulty was just what elocution sought to overcome. Yet it's hard to consider elocutionary exercise as a lyrical reading that would translate the script, the Heman's poem, the hypotext, into any sort of new intelligibility. Quite the opposite, right? It turns the poem into an ongoing series of stammerings, and frequently, as Robeson points out, physical beatings, if you don't get it right. The structural possibilities of language use more or less dwindle here to beating time. I'm thinking back to Peng's talk. I think these students kind of are ciphers at this point and could be quite interestingly quantified in a Moretti-esque fashion. But what's interesting is that it's a specific historical conception of the literary and performance that makes them into ciphers of the text rather than new performers capable of what we would call lyrical reading. Yet, I want to suggest that even this culture, this elocutionary culture and history of reading can itself be read lyrically. This is what I want to suggest what Elizabeth Bishop does in her version of Casabianca, which recalls the elocutionary afterlife of Heman's poem in order to recover both its pathos and prosodic flexibility. Try to read it, not easy. Love's the boy stood on the burning deck, trying to recite, the boy stood on the burning deck. Love's the son stood stammering elocution while the poor ship in flames went down. Love's the obstinate boy, the ship, even the swimming sailors, who would like a schoolroom platform too, or an excuse to stay on deck. And love's the burning boy. In reading this poem, I find that naming its genre is less compelling than its own citation of elocution as a powerful mode of language that sunk its teeth into Heman's poem. I don't know what Bishop thought of Heman's poem, but it seems to me that Bishop takes the sentimental pathos of the original, fused with the pathos of the stammering boy, and the pathos of the poem's appropriation by elocutionary training, and transforms this non- or anti-lyrical history into a surprising and sudden reevaluation of how, of all things, poetry expresses love. The first stanza of the poem is absorbed in a meditation on historical sound. The extreme compression of the first line holds on to the meter, roughly, but ensures a degree of stammering. In a precise sense, readers familiar with the original would have known to put stress on boy, which is here moved into the third position, whereas stood did not get stress, and that's moved into the fourth. The poem's not really in strict meter, but at least for the first line, you're tempted to do so. In addition to the metrical kind of play, the syntax by omitting the word who in the first line forces a very idiosyncratic transitive value, I think, for the verb stood. The boy was stood on the burning deck. By whom? Or perhaps the whole phrase, the boy stood on the burning deck, is the subject somehow, weirdly trying to say its own name. Loves the boy trying to name himself. It's not really clear. The poem's obsession with the verb stood repeats in lines 3 and 4 over an enjambment that again encourages us to supply a who, which, as in the first example, would make a nice fluidly alternating rhythm. So grammatically and metrically, she's stammering as much as possible. This extends to the rhyming. On and sun are slanted in both vowel sound and stress difference. If on receives stress, it's in clear opposition to the enjambed syntax. One elocutionary handbook specifically cites this line from Hemans, the first line, and warns against adding a caesura in the middle of the line and then stressing the word on. A lot of people worried about the stressing of the word on prepositions at this time in the 19th century. The fourth line continues this, what I could call like a slant rhyme leash, by hinting at a rather absurd pronunciation of elocution as elocution. And then the word down finishes this kind of virtuosic range of mutually slanting rhymes. So on, sun, elocution, down. It's hard to do that, to have four words that could be slant rhymes, but none of whom actually rhyme with each other. In this prosodically cruel stanza, the brave torment of Heman's sailor boy becomes the torment of language. The torment of the hypotext poem, conscripted and drilled into line by line, but squirming under the constraint. In the poem's extended metaphor, poetry's embrace by elocution, the thing that John Stuart Mill opposed to lyric, figures now filial or romantic love's descent into mere duty. Against this, the poem, which wishes to define love by incarnating love in its own form, becomes obstinate. The poem becomes love through obstinateness. Obstinateness, I shouldn't have said that 3 times in a row. Obstinateness at the level of sound and syntax becomes its expression, rejecting the schoolroom platform with reckless abandon. The boy, the sailors, even somehow the ship, want to remake the schoolroom platform into the very thing that Edna St. Vincent Millay said love wasn't. Quote, a floating spar to men that sink and rise and sink again. But love for this poem remains a burning. As it moves through its second stanza, the poem doesn't so much reject elocution for expression, as Mill kind of demanded, as rather rename both love and poetry as the suffering of historical mediation. Bishop's poem is lyric only insofar, in my view, as it reads elocution's non-lyrical historical reading practices. Rather than call the poem lyric, I'd call it a lyric reading, and call it that primarily because it cannot imagine itself being expressive through the elocutionary culture that Bishop would have encountered in Nova Scotia and probably in various forms at Vassar and so on, and you'd have to do a lot of work to really track down all of the kind of generic interlocutors here. Casabianca makes sense to me anyways as language and prosody defined against these reading practices. As with Baudelaire's Obsession, the poem forms itself as a reading of something that cannot be lyric. Casabianca then is not investigating the same tropes, or even tropes at all, because that's specific to Baudelaire's encounter with the history of poetry, and I'm sure that other critics, including Jonathan, could speak to encounters with the Alexandrine, with the sonnet, and so on. To conclude then, to some extent, Obsession and Casabianca are lyric readings in Jackson's sense of having transformed something not lyric into something that can be read as lyric. But here, I've tried to read them as effectively lyric theory in action. Lyric readings in the Domanian sense of testing the status and slippage of historical language power. Perhaps by reading poems as lyric readings, and indeed by asking whether lyric is at any given moment the right adjective, we might continue the work of historical poetics precisely in response to Jonathan's call for an alternate conceptual schema that still attends to the particularity of language. As always, I want to hear what you think, and thank you.
So I guess if I were wearing one of those name tags that Anne described it would be 2008 to yesterday. I just graduated, but now I have the pleasure of being Anne's colleague at UT Austin, so the transmission continues, I hope. And the piece that I'll be giving today emerges in some sense from my dissertation, which is on, as Roger talked about, late modernist poetry and its response to new technological theories of language. But it's also an homage to my time working with Jonathan on theory of the lyric as a research assistant and reader, and as a dissertation student, and a debate that we were having for many years. And this paper is a testament that Jonathan won. In the winter semester of 1906, Ferdinand de Saussure was vacationing in Rome. That fall, Saussure was to begin his lecture series in general linguistics, whose 5-year duration, faithfully recorded in the compiled notes of students, culminated in the volume by which Saussure's revolution achieved epoch-making renown in linguistics, semiology, and beyond. Yet, if we look to this semester in Rome to find Saussure hard at work preparing notes for this imminent disciplinary renaissance, we see instead a solitary man wandering with a notebook and pen through the ruins of the Roman Forum, at that time undergoing excavation. Saussure's vacation pastime, as his intellectual biographer Boris Gasparov has dubbed these long months of oblique research, began with a careful transcribing from the freshly unearthed marble, damaged inscriptions. As notations from the resurrected monuments, tombs, and temples multiply, Saussure begins to report what he terms a frightening discovery. Combining his transcripts from the ruins with a concomitant study of Saturnian verse, Saussure detects that beneath what he will famously pronounce as the arbitrary relation between signifier and signified lies another intransigent layer, an artifact of linguistic process more difficult in its excavation. This layer, this maddening process, is the phenomenon of the anagram, or rather the phenomenon of its dispersal, hiding it in plain view by virtue of dismemberment throughout the text. This name or keyword, having been broken up into phonic units similar to the syllable, is scattered across a line of text. He explains, in any inscription there is always a residue of consonants. The poet includes in his calculations the contents of a heading beyond the limits of the verse. The letters DMLCS, thus underscore versified, dedication to Deus Mandibus Luci Cornelii Scipionis Sacrum. But this theory of poetic calculations concerning the name refuses to be settled, continues ramifying. Saussure proceeds from these simpler monumental inscriptions to a study of ancient poetry, only to discover in Homer, Virgil, Lucretius, a more ramified anagrammatic process of syllabic recombination and dispersal. In spite of myself, the proof that all Homeric texts are nothing but a continual cryptogram is so compelling that nothing could deprive me of this conviction, he feverishly writes to a friend. But his assertion of mathematically regular anagrams underlying the monuments of literature engenders protest. Saussure's correspondents fear his new theories make Homer look like a strange, frivolous, and futile character. Saussure, too, reports uneasiness and a distancing froidissement esthétique toward the bard. It is as though the mechanics of a poetic device that make no contribution to either poetic meaning or to poetic affect unsettle too profoundly the poem's authenticity. Nonetheless, Saussure decides one cannot speak of anagrams as of a game, accessory to the versification. They become the foundation of that versification, whether the poet wishes it or not. Calling this diffuse and yet mysteriously ordered anagrammatic process by the name hypogram, Saussure writes in letters from this period that he has stumbled upon a generative operation of composition. He declares it tantamount to poetic rhyme, an abstract constraint in the service of poesis, a calculus of chance and origination. The fragmented anagram, he explains, poses no greater challenge to poesis than rhyme does. There should be no protest about this. Many a French poet has claimed that rhyme not only was no impediment to composition, but was, in fact, a guide and an inspiration. If the hypogram works like rhyme, but is not rhyme, in what way does its device differ? Saussure tortures himself over what to name the phenomenon, trying out paragram, logogram, anaphony in turns. He seems to prefer the hypogram. Why not anagram? The term hypogram is in no serious disagreement with the meanings upographene, upogrampe, upogramma, etc. Either allude to or reproduce in writing like a notary, a secretary, or even, this is still Saussure, or even if one thinks of this special but widely used meaning, to accentuate, souligner, with cosmetics, the features of the face. Surely this is not what Roman Jakobson quite means by later asserting the science of language investigates the makeup of verbal messages. How Saussure's anagrams might accede to science is from the beginning in question, as the methods mathematics, statistical or recombinatory, reveal a stranger science of poetic consciousness capable of producing what it may not wish. Indeed, this generalized anachromaticity seems to emanate from a source strictly parallel to human intention. How could such intricately patterned poetic language have left no treatises behind to tell of its practice? Is the phenomenon unconscious or an accidental property of linguistic systematicity? Is it possible these anagrams, epiphanic appearances, are merely diffracted illusions of accident? Chimerical forms within statistical plenitude, their trompe-l'oeil generated by idle curiosity in a vacationing Swiss professor's will to know. Much has been said about how Saussure's anagrammatic discoveries either presage or contradict the way his subsequent lectures position the role of human intention in its relation to human language. This paper will investigate something different, a gap in these critical discussions that open space for reconsidering Saussure as a literary theorist. Paul Demon has already unforgettably elaborated the relation between hypogram, inscription, and its implications for sense certainty. Yet although he ends his essay concerning Saussure's research with a close reading of a poem by Hugo, his lyrical act, the lyrical act that he reads, dissolves in its specificity, instead tracing a concatenation of tropes to reveal how description constitutes a device to conceal inscription. Demon's argument moves away from the lyric as a paradigm linked to the hypogram. What is the status of the lyric as such within Saussure's hypogrammatic theory? Saussure, as I hope to show, is thinking in verse and of verse. He arrives at a suspension of the category mistake of language's intentional content through examples from lyric practice. For Saussure, the hypogram's original import was not towards a theory of language, rather a theory unique to lyric composition. Saussure begins with Saturnian verse because it offers an archive of lyric forms existing in Latium before Greek hexameter grafted Hellenic sophistication onto earlier vernacular prosody. Saussure locates tightly organized anagrams in these short lyrics, then turns to the Latin epics, to Virgil and Lucretius, only to find a continuation of the practice. The anagrams grow more diffuse, but remain intelligible. One prominent example of Saussure's discovery of the Greek name of Aphrodite, dispersed syllabically in the opening proem of De Rerum Natura. Saussure finds that the prosodic device of the hypogram persists, its tacit structuration immemorially derived from vernacular practice. Surmising that long poems simply sustain the poetic devices first learned from lyrical works, he asks, why should we suppose that in this new form, the epic, it was liberated from everything which had until then constituted the recognized laws of poetry? His conclusion is, it implies lyric origins for epic poetry, a crucial assertion we must not overlook. In what follows, I shall propose along these lines a reconsideration of Saussure's hypogram in its relation to the so-called laws of poetry, remaining mindful of the ways that the hypogram's law-like regularities call into question the status of language's law, taking into account the architecture of genre, its structural integrities, with respect to the lyric's minimum of form. We require first a conceptual expansion of the techne involved in poiesis. We require an understanding that can encompass the example presented by the hypogram, one which manifests abstract, even mathematical dimensions in the midst of lyrical poiesis. Considering these dimensions of lyric language as a realm of linguistic abstraction, it is required to transgress one of the most well-established, though not entirely unanimous, critical doxa, namely that the patterning of lyric language, rhyme, rhythm, etc., suture poetry's ideational content to embodiment, phenomenality, concreteness, and especially materiality. What I believe can be shown through the example of the hypogrammatic lyric is that such oral, spatial, or textual materialism as theories of lyric phenomenality, cannot sufficiently account for this dimension of abstract and non-semantic intelligibility. Beyond the limit point of language's sensuous dimension, the perception of a hypergram in lyric occurs, a perceptibility not isomorphic with sensibility. To reinstate Saussure's hypergram as a revolution in the study of poetry is to initiate an investigation into what I'm calling lyric abstraction at the level of techne. Such an inquiry will not pursue matter's transubstantiation into meaning, nor be obliged by mimetic hermeneutics, where sound and sense felicitously correspond. Paul Valéry, speaking in a new way about this very old problem of lyric materiality, defines the poem as an event of dilated hesitation between sound and sense. In this, he preserves at a fascinating, yet ultimately unbreakable impasse, the ancient agonisms. Such rhetoric of suspension is usually also extended to the act of formalist poetic creation, as Susan Stewart both notes and endorses. Concepts of poetic freedom in form involve a certain balance between the will and contingency. Yet elsewhere, Valéry conjectures that a poetic device like rhyme may exist upon the poem, like an outdoor clock. La rime constitue une loi indépendante du sujet et est comparable à une horloge extérieure, outside clock. Note that, in this metaphor, rhyme is quite literally a poetic device, both apparatus and law, whose independence consists not in transcendence, but in epiphytic exteriority. Valéry's definitional antinomies suggest much about the predicament of modernist aesthetics. They also indicate that the exteriority of poetic law extends to and includes multitudinous abstract patternings within lyric language. Another modernist contemporary of Valéry's speaks of these features: the outlines of being and its expressings, the syllables of its law, poiesis, the literal characters, the Vatic lines. This quotation is drawn from a poem by Wallace Stevens, the poet whose abstract lyrical techne will be under examination in this paper with respect to the hypergram as device subtending rhyme. Wallace Stevens' relevance to this theory of abstraction at the level of techne is belied by his fame for abstraction at the level of content. This is, after all, the author of poems like The Search for Sound Free from Motion, Of the Surface of Things, Of Ideal Time and Choice, and of course, the ultimate poem is Abstract. Titles. Yet Stevens' abstraction is often married to absurdity in its choice of objects. He writes in an essay on the irrational, "If it is true that the most abstract painters paint herrings and apples, it is no less true that poets may find their solutions in a duck in a pond." As Stevens expounds in the poem, "Someone puts together a pineapple." Here the total artifice reveals itself as the total reality. Stevens' fame for irreverent discursive swerves, gauche objective correlatives, and nonsensical wordplay threatens always to overshadow his fame for philosophic abstraction. Accused of frivolity by admirers and detractors, the linguistic levity of this ultimate metaphysician of the modernist lyric classes him near that strange character of Saussure's cryptographic Homer. As it happens, it was the problem of rhyme in Wallace Stevens that brought me to the anagrammatic notebooks of Saussure. I had noticed, without being able to account for it, that while Stevens' poems felt highly determined by sonic patterning, they were poems that felt less musical when read aloud than when silently held in the mind. Certain that some network of internal rhymes could be found, well, I began to look through the auroras of autumn, only to discover that the internal rhymes were fractured, dispersed, organized by some syllabic recombinatrix. And that the poem I'll be looking at appears in a sesquicentennial, so wow, this is all coming together. Okay. Perfect, it's sesquicentenniality as such. In one poem, the nonsense detail of "inwoven by a weaver 212 bells" permutes in 2 lines later into the tutoyers of tragedy who speak softly to begin with from the eaves. And if you can hear that, I feel it when I'm reading it. There'll be a slide in a minute. In another poem, the gilded verlinesque detail presenting terraces of mandolins returns as syllabic recombination in the final line about stale demands of the blood. It was a desire to account for scores of such syllabic anagrams in Stevens that guided me to Saussure. I tried out Saussure's lyric hypogrammatization on the 1950 collection of Auroras of Autumn. Make no mistake, adopting the method was an experience of the folie of Saussure's Roman holiday. Reading poems in this way spectralizes their flesh in an exhausting radiography. I may never be able to read Stevens normally again, but the consistency I found with Saussure's algorithm surprised me. Stevens' Auroras of Autumn is generally declared his most abstract book. Helen Wendler has christened its eponymous poem his great poem of the void. Yet we may also note that Stevens conceives of the philosophic void opened up by abstraction as having its correlate at the level of techne. In another of the collection's long poems, An Ordinary Evening at New Haven, I said to Ben that New Haven had been here, he describes how a blank underlies the trials of device, the dominant blank, the unapproachable. We may read these lines hermeneutically, mimetically, or as I am suggesting, hypogrammatically. So, reading these lines hermeneutically, we hear how poetic techne's eternal struggles and trials of device are ultimately predicated upon some hegemonic and unapproachable nihilism, some mind of winter here abstracted as blank. In a mimetic reading, we could convert the poem's spatiality into signification. We might note how the typographic device for representing stanzaic breaks does literally underlie the line that describes it. In this style of reading, the blank line's conventionality mimes a kind of phatic muteness. But how to read these lines for a theme word, cryptogram? This section of the long poem ends by abstractly asserting, the serious reflection is composed neither of comic nor tragic, but of commonplace. Okay, so taking this hint of composition, commonplace, we may look back at the two lines bracketing the stanza break and find that these lines actually do hypergrammatize the word commonplace. There's an animation. It didn't work. Why? There. Okay. Commonplace. Okay. Taking this hint, oh wait, I said that. Moreover, this pattern is repeated in the pairs of lines that bridge the succeeding two stanza breaks. You see that? I didn't do an animation for that. So I found so many more. I'm not going to show you all of them. Section 21 hypogrammatizes to there. There's one for apocalypse, one for alpha and omega where both are being hypogrammatized. In each, there were 23 total occurrences in 18 lines. I mean, what do you say? Statistical improbabilities abounded, more than I can possibly demonstrate here. So besides the fact that Saussure would be overjoyed, what does this mean? What Saussure and perhaps even Stevens are trying to tell us is, this is the wrong question. Abstraction at the level of techne is not about meaning, but about doing, structuring, patterning, acting at a distance. This active abstraction produces not semiology, but more a logico-mathematical tautology. A is A, square root of -1 equals I, or as Stevens so devilishly disappoints in his 1939 essay on methodology for the Oxford Anthology of American Literature, my intention in poetry is to write poetry. I do this because I feel the need of doing it. This spirit of lyric tautology delights in equations more than occasions for verse. This returns us to the final objection Saussure's lyric hypogram raises in his contemporaries, the question of consciousness and intention. What underlies the trials of device in the lyric, if not the subject? The subject, or hypokaimenon in Greek, translates literally to that which underlies the trials of device, perhaps. Yet this human hypokaimenon is here displaced by a deeper substratum, a mathematics of language, calcul des chances, and syllabic sparagmos. As Jonathan Culler writes during this period in his book on Saussure, the picture of language tantalizingly offered by the pursuit of anagrams seems to go further, questioning the idea that language is a system of signs by suggesting, 1, that there are forces at work below the level of the sign, and 2, that signs are not phenomenally given. Here the question of what underlies the subject intersects with the question of an abstract, non-sensuous, non-phenomenally given linguistic dimension. For Jakobson and other structural linguists in the age of information theory, linguistics pursues an underlying code. Can we speak of what hypochimerically underlies this hypogrammatic subject as its code? The hypogram imitates nothing but itself. It underlines, it underlies. Its second contrived being is tautological, reproducing and writing less like a copyist than like a notary, emphasis, not fidelity. My intention in writing is to write poetry. Even more than rhyme, it is the hypogram that best reveals lyric's abstraction, its exteriority, since the hypogram's intellectual registration cannot be subsumed into sensuous mimeticism. Jean Starobinsky admits that there could be no question of recognizing it. Hypogrammatic reading develops at another tempo and in another time. At its limit, one leaves behind the consecutive time appropriate to habitual language. Leaving aside linear consecutive time, the diachronic time of parole, we do not yet enter the realm of the synchronic and its systematicity. There is, in fact, no system for the hypogram. The hypogram is simply an algorithm, a procedural possibility that alters the event of language and renders it lyric. I will take this stanza from Stevens to offer a poetic equivalent for Saussure's notes on the lyric affinity for the hypogram, and he will conclude my talk. We do not prove the existence of the poem. It is something seen and known in lesser poems. It is the huge, high harmony that sounds a little and a little suddenly by means of a separate sense. It is and it is not, and therefore is. In the instant of speech, the breath of an accelerando moves captive, the being widens, and was there.
Avery, I first have a purely formal observation or compliment. That was tremendous drama. Not only in the mathematics of abstracting of the piece of technology, but then for having a significant period of suspense was whether you might be about to show us something of the same insanely hidden order.
Oh yeah, and I have those slides.
So I know, and so since you emerged from that underworld, but there was the great drama that you might remain and then you might watch it. So I want to thank you for that, and that was very artfully done and beautifully written and read. I just want to, you directed our attention to that in Saussure's conception, the lyrical therefore would precede the epic in some very primal sense, and it felt like you were directing our attention there particularly. And so I just wanted to know if that played into your sense finally of the ways in which a hypogram could be a so fundamentally productive a constraint for a poem. And but it's hard for me to imagine exactly what you're imagining, but that is the area of my question and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to me that, just the fact that Saussure starts there, and that he starts there not with a lyric that is expressive or mimetic or representational. He's starting with a lyric that's about cryptographic precision. That's what he finds in all these inscriptions. So it's that kind of lyric, right? So that heritage of lyric as what inspires epic connects to something like Milman Parry and Lord's hypothesis about formulas that repeat in epic poetry, and that comes later. So one wonders if they read. But this idea that there's an algorithmic dimension that is part of the composition, that's the lyric that I want to point to with Saussure.
Great, that helps extremely.
Okay.
Avery, that was great. My sense of the excitement of Saussure's discovery has to do with his having discovered that you couldn't determine from internal evidence whether an anagram was there or not, whether a hypogram was there or not. It was definitely there in the sense that the distribution of letters was there, but you couldn't determine if it was there as an anagram, right? So it's a matter of indeterminably significant signs or marks. And the question that I then have is how and whether that is different from the necessity of making an interpretive decision in order to register a given linguistic or rhetorical element as literal or figurative. How is it alike or different to not know the meaningful status of a mark and to not know whether a mark is gathered up in itself and literal in that sense or is figurative or allegorical? I wonder if you have a take on that.
I'm going to think about that because that's such a great addition to what I'm talking about. Yes, I mean, I do think that, he has to encounter the undecidability of the science that he's trying to found and then make a choice to keep going. Thinking, well, what's this going to lead to? So, I can see how in that way, right, there can't be a literal reading of that. But then I suppose that's why I want to emphasize this abstraction or the mathematics, which can really go into literal or tropological, right? So the statistical properties of something being there, right, has to be accounted for. And then, of course, when Jakobson is trying to bring the statistical theory of language, merge it with linguistics, I think the kind of prehistory is there with Saussure. But I'm going to keep thinking about what you've asked. That's where I tried to position that, but yes, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, 3 very interesting, very different papers about the lyric, which is exciting and striking. Bob, it's the poetry of disclosure, of phenomenology. Ben, whose work is really mostly in historical prosody, he boldly took on the task which threatened to make him adjudicate between 2 teachers and 2 strong supporters of his work, because Jenny Jackson and I have been recently at each other's throats. We both agree in supporting Ben for trying to find a way to reconcile the 2 of us in some sense, preserving his lyrical reading without jettisoning the character of the category of lyric altogether. Avery, I take it that the argument that you said I had won was an argument about, which didn't really come out explicitly in the talk, it was an argument about poetics versus hermeneutics, and anti-hermeneutic. You were tilting over to the anti-hermeneutic side, that your focus on apparatus poeticus allowed you to abandon hermeneutics for a moment and look at the insistence of the letter in some sense in Stevens, which is with very striking examples. But one of the, so I think you all seem to be doing quite different things. But one of the things that struck me was that what made each paper powerful and successful was coming back to a thematization of whatever it was you were doing, a lyric thematization of whatever it was you were doing, especially as in the Stevens poem right at the end. And I wonder if the 3 of you have any thoughts about that. If it is a temptation, you're doing some high-powered sort of critical maneuvers, and then how do you finish up, how do you conclude a paper? You find a poem which actually says this thing that you've been working very hard to say. I'm glad that you all did it in some sense. Is that what does that have to say about theory of the lyric, or the kinds of maneuvers in which you were engaged? If the best thing you can come up with is a poem that dramatically already articulates the kinds of views you've been trying to.
Insofar as my argument was in part that we ought to look for lyric in the form of lyric theory, seeing the relation between genre and reading is very close indeed, especially, I would say, by the 20th century and by the mid-century, for reasons that I think have a lot to do with things like education, what Bishop would have encountered. I don't think I had any choice, but, I mean, there are only a few poems I could have picked that would have done the kind of work that I'm sensitive to that. I think if you took my entire dissertation, you could have a pamphlet of about 12 pages. It would be all of the poetry you needed to read in order to study it. So it's harder with prosody, poems that refer to rhythmic character. I mean, a lot of them do, which is what makes it compelling. But in this case, I think I had to begin and end with the possibility of poetry as theory. Yeah.
I suppose the question is sort of about the status of example in the, I mean, that for me, it was a different experience doing this, because I do like to incorporate the poetry into what I'm saying. But in this, the example was also a test case at first, because I didn't really know. I mean, I was just trying to figure out something about, and I had to treat it in a different way, right? So it did feel different, and I did feel an urge to sort of, let me put something back that doesn't have highlighted letters at the end, right? And, let's just have Wallace Stevens put the ending onto that, so, yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So my understanding is in your argument with Jackson, you're not especially sympathetic to a
a kind of historical typology of kinds of lyric, or types of lyric, that you do want to construct a model of the lyric. I was thinking of your comment, you find what you want. How do you find what the lyric is in your own theoretical model without, in some sense, historical induction? So this society's called this a lyric, but they don't really call this a lyric.
Well, I guess saying a word about my argument with Jenny Jackson is probably the best way to approach that. If I was very supportive of the Dickens's Misery book, which I confess. What though it's a book that argues that for Dickinson, writing poems was just sort of part of her everyday activity, sending letters to friends, etc., and that then 20th century criticism comes along and makes all these into lyrics and treats them as objects of interpretation, essentially, that they're there in order to be interpreted as the act of a lyric persona. I think that in doing that, and in the process, she says, they've collapsed all the old 19th century lyric genres. In fact, she's very vague about what those genres were, and it's really different modes of circulation. It's poems in newspapers, it's broadsides, it's not actual. She doesn't have a substitute set of, I kept sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop, as it were, when she would tell us what the genres were that Dickinson was writing in. But Dickinson uses hymn meters, but nobody's going to say she's actually writing hymns. She's writing lyrics that use hymn meters, and that's very important for their effects. So it's what would be. So I was still sympathetic to her enterprise of sort of historicist enterprise of trying to say 20th century, especially when she's focusing on the way in which 20th century criticism has made the lyric above all an object for classroom interpretation in some sense. So what we now believe is poems exist to be excavated and find meaning. So I'm very sympathetic to opposing that, the notion that that's what the purpose, that's what a poem exists for. But in the lyric theory reader, what she does is list everyone, including Demond, with absolute bizarre misreadings, such as saying that obsession is a prose poem, in order to make, so everyone in the lyric and reader anthology is conscripted as part of this deluded company who erect this thing called the lyric and ignore all historicity. The only ones who escape are people who don't have any interest in the lyric at all, such as Jacobson, for whom that's not, he's talking about poetic functions of language, and her buddy, Columbia, his name I've forgotten at the moment here, but no, sorry, her friend who writes about Adorno. But anyway, and Adorno himself was not interested in lyric particularly as a genre. But so it's that attempt to just decry lyric as some sort of historical illusion, and without erecting anything else in its place. If we were to say that there is a certain kind of lyric that exists, a pre-romantic lyric and then a post-romantic lyric, that would certainly be fine. But I think that, among other things, we need the category of lyric, if only to have something to write the history of, and a general category, and then you can talk about variations in the lyric, and the attempt, especially much more so in the lyric theory reader than in her earlier book, to dismantle it, to treat everyone else as deluded, and she and Yopi are the only ones who have seen the truth about our historical construction of lyric is silly. Also, there's a conflation of quite different historical moments: the 19th century moment and the 20th century moment, when what we get above all is the replacement of the romantic model of lyric as intense affective expression of the poet by the dramatic monologue lyric, where it's a fictional lyric has the work of a fictional speaker. You have to discover who's speaking in what circumstance, etc. They're two quite different models, and she sort of pushes them all together as a bad work of criticism, which has made these things into lyrics. So it's supposed to be you guys answering questions.
Keep going a little bit.
That's why I always got out of hard questions. Thanks. So I have a question that I think follows up on that nicely, and it's for Ben. So when Demond writes that correspondence is not a lyric, he obviously proceeds from an extremely narrow, restricted conception of the lyric, which I don't think we can call even romantic, but perhaps at most post-romantic. And what would happen if we were to do what, at least for me, is much more intuitive and certainly much more instructive, namely to just presuppose naively that both obsession and correspondance are lyrics. Okay? Maybe they are two sides of the lyric, maybe even two poles of what we call the lyrical. What would happen then to our understanding of the history of the lyric? If you ask me, I think it would improve it. That is, it would improve our understanding of the history of the lyric. Because especially if you go back and look at what was originally called lyric, namely poetry performed accompanied by the lyre and so on and so forth, you have this declarative moment so clearly, often at the very beginning of lyrics, right? If you take Pindar, water is best, or, in a modern poet, influenced by Pindar, Hölderlin, was bleiben aber stiftende Dichter, and their poems are remembered precisely for these sort of terse gnomic statements, and I think that for them, these statements are really crucial to what lyric poetry is, right? So it seems to me that both de Man and perhaps Virginia Jackson as well, I'm not so familiar with her work, but it seems to me that they're both critiquing this very narrow conception of the lyric, whereas what we should do is perhaps to expand it. So I'm wondering what your position is on that. Because what de Man says happens in the transformation from correspondance to obsession. The first shift that he mentions is the transformation from the declarative to the vocative, right? But if you look historically at, especially ancient lyrics, it becomes extremely clear that declarative is important for the lyric, right?
You could almost forget them being two lyrics. They could just be one lyric that is a pair of sonnets. You could treat them that way. That's, in a way, how I'm treating it. What I'm trying to get from de Man is something that I think he does that not a lot of other critics do, which is to invite one poem to read another as a hypotext. In this case, I don't know what the relationship. It's that move that I'm trying to recover as central. Again, I'm not sure this is the direction I want to go to say that's central to the lyric, but it's something that de Man lines up with the word lyric at that moment. I think that's valuable. He means something like a place where subjective interiority establishes itself. And his point, I think, is that obsession they're really interesting together because there's a need to take correspondance and show how it's just the tropes that could permit tropes of interiority, but not interiority itself. In that moment where he's saying we need to read rhetorically, but he's also saying poems read rhetorically, and I think that's what I'm really trying to. And there's no question that Bishop is reading the history of a very specific rhetorical usage of language. So I'm almost over-literalizing it here. I'm doing something quite different from de Man in the end. I don't think he would make that turn. I'm suggesting that it's a possible turn that I think leads to a different understanding of the Bishop poem. So I wouldn't call them both lyrics. I think they're part of a chain of lyric readings. And I'm not sure if we get any further by calling them lyrics, because the distinction de Man makes where one can't be a lyric because another poem is reading its failure to be a lyric, that's really interesting to me, and I think a neat model for the practice of rhetorical reading. So I'm afraid that if we name them in the same genre, we lose the sense that they might actually be doing critical work in relation to each other, right?
Yeah, but it seems to me that if there is such a thing as a critical lyric, right, then we would have to accept that a lyric can perform a lyrical reading, right? That it can question its own transformation from this type of language into this type of language. That it's not completely opaque to itself.
Yeah.
It's not completely transparent to itself either. Yeah. But and it seems to me that for de Man, the lyric cannot contain that. If you step out of it, and so like a critical lyric doesn't really exist for de Man.
I'm not sure he ever calls anything a lyric in that poem. I think he calls it a lyrical reading. So I don't want to bog us down. I think. Yes, I'm interested in critical lyric. And I guess my question to Jonathan is, are you really interested in critical lyric, right? In your interest in the particularity of language, are you primarily interested in poetry that is doing the kind of work that Dumont sees obsession doing with a hypotext? And if that's so, that would be an interesting place to intersect with historical modes of language.
Yes, but I'm also certainly agree with Klaus's claim that lots of things that I want to call lyrics are declarative, fundamentally declarative. And what I'm mostly fighting against at this moment is the notion of lyric as fiction. I want to say that they're not fiction. They're about this world, not creating a fictional world with fictional characters. We should get another question or two and then stop for a coffee break.
Yeah, thank you for all those papers. That was really great. Avery, I just have a very naive question, and maybe I missed that moment in your presentation, but I was wondering that even though you, for good reasons, don't want to have the subject as a sort of underlying substrate, I wonder where the moment of the question of subjective agency comes in, because when you're looking at those hypergrams or anagrams, when you're saying like, oh, this can't just be a statistical probability, it's still something that someone has done, right? I mean, so it's not just the machinery of language, which would actually be the statistical probability. It's precisely really improbable that it's there, hypergrammatically inscribed, and that points to, that requires a moment of subjective agency. So I wonder how you theorize that moment. I mean, I'm sympathetic to not theorizing as something that underlies language, but I still think you need a theorization of that moment of subjective agency for your account to work.
Yes, and so first I would say, and this is a shorter version of something where I do talk about this in the longer one, and so subjective agency but unconscious, and I'm on the side that the unconscious can do this. Okay, so that's my first premise. I can't prove it, so I'm just going to say that it can. But here's what it means, I think, for Saussure, and here's where agency comes in for Saussure. It's the agency of memory, and I think his conversation with Freud, whose Psychopathology of Everyday Life is published 6 years before this. And Saussure, he wants to show that, he says something like, imagination it transmits meaning across a memory gap, sur lacune, across this gap. And this is the main source of, or the main agent of change. This is the main agent of change in the text. And then what's left out in the English translation, interestingly, and this is why I read the French, is it says that this imagination is doing this by a default of memory. So imagination and a default of memory are working together to create this change in the text. Now, is this agency, right? In what way is it agency? And we need Freud, I think, to think that. But he does this really interesting kind of excavation problem, where one classicist says, in this rendering of something, it's posenia, and he says, no, it's postsenia, and I'm going to find an anagram to show you that there's a T in there, and he does the anagram. Okay, so this is what he wants to use the process for, right? A reconstruction. And he's saying that the letters will not be forgotten in the same way that, like, a word will be forgotten, because there's not the same motivation to forget. And he doesn't fully flesh this out, but this is, I think, what's so interesting about what he's trying to do, where he doesn't want to settle the question of, intention and agency so much. So I don't know, myself how to settle it, but that's the answer I would give to that. It's a real problem.
I have a really quick question in that case. Does that mean that what you are studying here now is what is for you the vanishing horizon of verbal ordering? It's not conscious. So you can't see it happening, but it's the deepest level of pattern that we can continue to intuit.
And not
syntax,
some level,
which
is
is that right?
Yes, I think so. I think it's right in that I think I'm understanding you, and yes, the horizon, the vanishing horizon, and it's not syntax, right? And this is also why Saussure is saying, I'm not talking about writing, and then we think, oh, that's because you hate writing, Saussure, but it's not that. He also says, and I'm not talking about the phonic. I want to say phone, but if I said phone, we'd be thinking of some monstrous phone presence that, I don't remember exactly how he puts it, but he has some idea of like a monstrous voice behind language. Cool. But anyway, so he doesn't want to decide between, logos and phone. He doesn't want to decide this. He's seeing a structure, an abstract structure that's not syntax, right? And it's not semantics, it's something else, and it's recombination. And it's recombination of something that alphabet doesn't capture, phone doesn't capture, right? So he's trying to invent it through this hypergram, and then he abandons it in 1909. But it's really interesting to me.
Ben Glaser. I like reading a lot, and I was thinking about the title of the book and Bishop's biography a little bit and her relationship to Brazil. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the title of the poem that she borrows from and the relationship between elocutionary training and foreign language learning, right? Her engagement with a language that's obviously invoked throughout the text, invoked throughout her life, but not necessarily present in the poem in the way that you've described it.
Yeah, I don't know her biography well enough to know, and I don't know the exact year when she wrote Casabianca, so the short answer is... Right, no, not to the first poem. No, right, but her poem is also titled Casabianca. I don't know whether she wrote it before, I don't know if she had been to Brazil when she I don't think she had. I think she went to Brazil for the first time in the 50s? She had, so I don't think this has, there's a really interesting question there about how her oeuvre more generally might be structured by historical uses of language or reading practice that I would like to do in probably really my second book. There's been some really neat work on her, the essay she wrote on Hopkins, of all things, at Vassar. There's some really neat stuff that I would just be rehearsing. I think that, the kinds of defamiliarization that she describes in Questions of Travel and elsewhere might not be so far from what she's trying to do. That's a really rough, obviously, leap. But when she looks at her fellow tourists, she sees a mode of experiencing the world that is, I think, similar, maybe, to the boy who stands stammering elocution. She's looking for alternate ways. She's skeptical of her own relation to travel. But I would say it has something to do with her critique that you can also see in other poets of tourism and travel, and this question of how do you go to another place correctly might be actually a really interesting question about poetic genre as well. But I don't think that there's a relation to Brazil specifically yet here.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.